Hey guys, it's Danny. Today we're talking about 10 things that can and will kill your orchids if you let them unchecked. 10 of the most common things that orchids can suffer from in cultivation. We seem to focus a lot on what makes us happy, such as the flowers. Make your orchid flower all the time, don't cut the flower spikes, have multiple branches and so on and so forth. But do we stop to think that maybe these things don't really make them happy? Well, today I'm gonna address that as well. So we will go really quick through 10 common things that I believe can be the cause of your orchid's decline. Today's video, together with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could need to properly take care of your orchid, from potting mixes to pots, fertilizers, accessories, and much more. So I'll link you to their website down below. Feel free to check them out at any time. Also, I'll link you to some of the products that I personally use almost on a daily basis, or I really love generally. I think they are great. So you'll have all of that in the description. On their website, you actually have some care articles as well. You also have my videos, which is great. So a lot of good stuff. Check them out at any time. Right, with that said, let us start with what I believe is the number one reason orchids are just lost in cultivation. And that is water trapped in vital structures, meaning in the crowns of orchids, in between the leaves, in the new growths, particularly for sympodials. This water trapped in these structures can lead to rotting. Crown rot and stem rot are a direct result of that, and we do have a lot of videos on those ailments as well. They're pretty serious. Due to the way many home growers grow these orchids, meaning potted, upright, in conditions that don't really favor evaporation of water, water can sometimes get stuck in between the leaves and in the crowns, and the more it stays there, the more bacteria and pathogens it accumulates. These things can start to attack and damage the natural barrier of the leaves, the cuticle, and especially in crowns where there's a lot of fresh growth, not yet mature growth, we have a very weak spot for pathogens to attack the orchid. So misting and showering are not very advisable techniques in home growing, depending on your climate, but just to be safe, I do advise any beginner not to shower orchids from above or water them from above or mist them or spray them in any way that could trap water in their structures. Now, one of the smartest comeback to this statement is, well, orchids in nature, they get rained on all of the time. Why don't they have issues? Well, because we're missing one very vital component in cultivation, and that is wind. There isn't a lot of air movement usually in our homes to properly facilitate evaporation of water. And that's just one of the factors. The type of water in nature, rainwater, is very different than tap water. The quality of the air is very different as well, and also the pathogens in their natural habitats are very different than the ones we have. Our houses are actually very alien environments for these orchids, but we try to do our best. And one of the best things we can do given our alien circumstances is not to let that water trapped in the growths of an orchid. Another very common thing that can kill an orchid is root suffocation. And as the name suggests, it means that the roots of an orchid can actually get suffocated to the point of completely being lost. Now, most of the orchids we grow and love are epiphytic, meaning they don't naturally grow in soils, but rather in the air, be it on a tree or on rocks or a mixture of things. Bottom line, their roots are never actually suffocated by heavy soils. So for this reason, many home growers like to use slotted pots that have extra ventilation for more aeration. We like to use an airy potting mix that has more chunky pieces, maybe in association with something more water retentive, but bottom line, it's not soil. And this is because roots can actually get suffocated much easier on orchids than other terrestrial plants. Another problem is that the potting mix orchids come in is already pretty old, especially the ones in flower shops that are in bloom. They are in that medium for about 2 years or so, is my estimate. And by that time, the bark starts to break down and loses its integrity. It becomes mushy. And when that happens, it starts to really soak up that water and loses its shape and its rigidness and starts to suffocate the roots. Hence why I advise beginners to repot their orchids after they purchase them, not in the same day, but shortly after purchase, just to make sure that the potting mix is airy enough so that the roots don't get suffocated. Otherwise, there is a real danger of the roots just giving up on you one day and you're gonna wonder, why is my orchid having root rot all of a sudden? Well, it might very well be the fact that they just suffocated in their potting mix. On the other end of the spectrum, dehydration. This is a serious cause as well. Orchids are indeed very drought tolerant, especially Phalaenopsis orchids, but they're not invincible. So dehydration occurs when we don't water our orchids in time, most of the time, or we are using an inadequate potting mix for our environment. Now you can see this orchid is not potted in the same things you saw the other orchids in. Well, inside here I have only sphagnum moss and you can see I don't have a slotted pot. This works pretty good in my environment, which is very, very hot. Inside I still have a very airy environment, but because in my environment I am very prone to dehydrate my orchids through lack of time to water, I resort to a little help from the potting mixes. If I would leave this orchid be and follow the advice of watering my orchid once a week and have it potted in a traditional bark mixture, it would not be here today. It would be so dehydrated that it would completely be lost. When dehydration happens, the first ones to go typically are the roots. Then the orchid will start to lose its leaves, and then at the end it will completely lose its crown. So it's a snowball effect. Once you lose the roots, it's really hard to hydrate the orchid and it will just dehydrate more and more if you don't intervene. The best thing to do is to not let it go there, so make sure you are on top of your watering schedule. Don't water your orchid once every 7 days because I don't know what article said so. No, water your orchid when it's dry. In your environment, it can be every 3 days or 5 days or 10 days. It really, really depends. Everybody will have a different schedule depending on the season as well. So make sure you offer water when the medium is dry, not once a week. If it coincides with the once a week schedule, that's great. It might not in the winter, but in order to avoid dehydration, you have to keep an eye on your orchid and see how fast it dries out. Luckily, orchids do show you when they need water. They become droopy and limpy, so don't ignore your orchid. We're gonna get to that as well. Just keep an eye on it, especially when you know the seasons are changing and maybe water evaporation rates change as well. Next common thing that can destroy your orchid is extreme sunshine, especially in the summertime. Direct sunshine can overheat orchid leaves, and that can lead to sunburns. I have encountered orchids that were so badly damaged by the sun that you just could not recoup them. And I saw them a lot in garden centers or flower shops. When the flowers are done, these orchids are placed wherever the company has them placed, and sometimes it's in direct sunshine, and they get cooked. Some orchids are more prone to this, for example, Phalaenopsis. The ancestors of those orchids do not grow in direct sunshine. They actually grow shaded under the forest canopy. So they're not really adapted to withstand direct sunshine and they can get burned pretty easily. But even things like a Cattleya, which is a lot more adapted for sunshine, if these orchids are not acquainted with direct sunshine, they can burn in a matter of minutes. And usually high temperatures associated with direct sun can burn even the most sun-tolerant plants. So you can imagine if we lose the entire leaf system, the orchid cannot make food for itself, and that's a big problem. But not only that, for example, with Phalaenopsis, you can burn the entire crown and axis, which is the core of the plant. It's the place they grow new leaves from. If that's destroyed, it's pretty much game over. Just check the leaves. Light and sun in general is okay. It's not enough to burn leaves. But once you feel the leaves getting hot, that is a sign that you need to move the orchid, put it somewhere else, or use artificial light. Orchids grow great under grow lights. So maybe this is something you could consider if you don't have enough light. Grow lights cannot burn leaves unless the leaf actually touches the bulb. Other than that, if the leaf does not overheat, it will not burn, no matter how red it will get. Next up, extreme temperatures, both extreme hot temperatures and cold temperatures. Most of the orchids we grow, yet again, are tropical in nature, and their preferred temperature is pretty much the same one that we like. So anywhere in between 15 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius, most of these guys will be very comfortable. Out of this range, it can be quite damaging for the orchids. Both extreme cold and extreme heat can determine cell collapse and deterioration and death of tissue, which is something we do not want because it can lead to secondary infections. Not to mention, these orchids will not perform and grow normally under temperatures that they're not adapted to work in. Most people have great success with orchids in their natural home temperatures, but once these temperatures fluctuate to the extremes, things change. So remember, orchids like the same temperatures as we do. There are species which can definitely tolerate more extreme than others, but since most home growers go for phalaenopsis and dendrobiums and cattleyas, these extremes can be very detrimental and can lead to complete loss of your plant. So keep things balanced. If you're comfortable in your home, your orchid will be as well. Next up, one you might have not heard about before unless you know my channel, exhaustion. And phalaenopsis orchids are especially prone to this. By exhaustion, I mean depleting of one's energy through overproducing of flowers or producing too many keikis. Now, phalaenopsis are really fun plants and they're really rewarding because they can bloom a lot. We can try to induce new blooms and new flower spikes, but not only that, we can also induce keikis through the use of hormonal pastes. But see, all of these things have downsides, and if we overdo it, there is a very high chance that the orchid will get exhausted and depleted of energy. Flowers take a lot of energy to produce, and while in normal conditions an orchid can have a great flush of blooms, trying to initiate more blooms over its capacity, especially when it's time to grow new structures, can actually weaken the plant a lot, and that can lead to all sorts of issues, from stress and lack of proper growth to being more susceptible to disease and pests. So everything we do needs to be balanced and within a certain limit. Yes, we all love flowers, but there is a time when the orchid needs to stop flowering and focus on active vegetative growth. Vegetative growth helps it survive. Flowers helps the species survive in time. But in our living rooms, we don't control the survival of the species through seeds, but we can control the survival of the individual. If you want, sure, you can cut a flower spike and induce another branch, but maybe try to stop there. Don't keep going for 2 years. Phalaenopsis definitely can, particularly if you have a cooler environment, but maybe just don't. Maybe limit yourself to just a few more flowers and then wait for the next season's flowering. Next up, extreme removal of vital structures. This sounds a little weird. Well, in our desire to multiply orchids or share them or just have more of the same thing pretty much, sometimes what we do is over-divide orchids. This is especially valid for sympodial orchids which produce pseudobulbs. It's really easy to propagate orchids through division, and we have a video on it, check it down below. But again, it's not advisable to overly do it. Yes, orchids can actually be propagated through single pseudobulbs as well. It takes more time and the risk is a little greater, but it's possible. What is not okay is to make as many divisions as to not actually have a mother plant anymore. So I would not advise anybody to try and overly propagate through division their orchids. If you check the video on division down below, you will see there is a rule to doing so, and I do advise you to respect that rule. Otherwise, you can end up with a whole bunch of divisions that might not even be viable. So in the end, you might actually lose the entire orchid because you overly propagated it. And also remember, new growths are not baby plants for sympodial orchids. It's part of the very same plant. You can't remove it and plant it separately because chances are it will not develop. And particularly if it doesn't have roots, it still depends on the other structures for energy, which is something that makes orchids different, so be careful with over-propagation. Another reason that could lead to loss of your orchid is starvation. And by this I mean lack of fertilizer, which is a super important component of an orchid's life. Without fertilizer, without those nutrients, the functions of an orchid will not be adequate. Photosynthesis, breathing, growth in general is not adequate without fertilizer. Now, orchids generally are very slow feeders or very light feeders in comparison to other plants, so you will not notice the effects right away. It will take time. Hence why many people fall into the false assumption that orchids really don't need fertilizer, they just need water. But then within a few years or so, the orchids are so depleted they cannot even grow long leaves anymore. They resort to growing very, very tiny structures simply because they do not have the prime matter that they need to utilize in order to grow these structures. And of course, in the end, without these resources, they will just deplete. Water and sun is just not enough to keep an orchid alive long term. It can survive for a few months, a year or two, but then slowly and surely you will see it depleting before your eyes. So do not starve your orchid, offer proper fertilizer. Find your balance, don't overdo it, follow the instructions most of the time, they know what they're talking about, and use an orchid adequate fertilizer, and you should be just fine, and you should have beautiful bloom shows year after year, and no stunted growth. Next up, this is a new one for our videos. This orchid is a little tall. I like to show you different orchids when I make these videos, just so you have ideas for your wish lists and things to discover. But some orchids are so tall, and so fragrant, that they simply do not fit in the frame. Alrighty, next up, this is a new reason for losing orchids. Clickbait hacks, you guys. Now, hacks, in the true meaning in which it was intended, they're good. Tips and tricks that can make your life easier with orchids are welcome, and I love to do them. I love to give you very easy tips to make your life easier, but there are some people who kind of push it to an extreme in which the things that they advise you to do are really not beneficial. And here I'm gonna mention the food hacks and all of that nonsense, which slowly and surely is starting to create problems, and I see it in the comment section. More and more people start to tell me that they have all sorts of mold outbreaks or all sorts of root problems due to the fact that they just watered with some banana peels or whatever food scraps are popular in that particular moment in time. One thing to remember is that while indeed composting food scraps is good and it works and it definitely creates fertilizer for your garden, orchid pots are not compost piles. They really do not work in the same way. What will end up happening is the breaking down will partially start to happen in your pot, but it will involve molds, which are not always good. Sometimes they will affect orchids as well. They will involve byproducts of this breakdown, which are not safe for orchid roots, and all of this happening pretty slow and pretty incomplete in comparison to how they would happen in a normal and healthy compost pile. So in the end, you can have serious issues with your orchid, serious root damage, and serious mold outbreaks, which I'm not sure how healthy they are for you, since you're gonna pretty much have breaking down organics next to you, in your bedroom, in your kitchen, in your living room. So my advice is to completely ignore these types of videos. The more surreal or too good to be true it sounds, it typically is. Just stick to normal water and fertilizer and try to limit organics that are not broken down pretty much at all in orchid pots. And lastly, this is one I always like to end these types of videos with: neglect. Ignoring your orchid and neglecting it can lead to its demise. It's even very logical. Consider the following scenario. Your orchid has a pest infestation, let's say, but because a wise guy on the internet once said orchids thrive on neglect, you're just going to not touch your orchid, neglect it, and not do anything about it when it's at the beginning. Once the pest infestation spreads and becomes overwhelming, it's really hard to get rid of it. And chances are your orchid will suffer so much that it will be set back in the best case scenario, or it's gonna be gone if you really don't address the pest infestation. And that's something we can apply to other scenarios as well. Let's say from winter to summer, you don't adjust your watering schedule because you do not keep an eye on the potting mix of your orchid, and you assume that your schedule will remain the same. And what will happen is that the orchid will slowly and surely dehydrate because water evaporates faster in summer. And there are so many examples that I can give you in which neglect can lead to your orchid's demise. That is not funny anymore, and I think at this point it has been enough years of propagating this really bad advice of ignoring your orchid in order to make it thrive. What you should do is find balance. Don't go overboard with the watering and the pampering and all of these things in an attempt to make it happy, but also don't go overboard with ignoring it. Ignoring it is, in my opinion, worse than over pampering. Learn what your orchid needs. It's really easy nowadays. We have all of this internet at our disposal, and keep things balanced and you should be just fine. Do not neglect your orchids, and let's collectively forget that somebody once said that orchids thrive on neglect because they just didn't understand their orchids. And that's the truth. In order to grow beautiful orchids, we just need to understand them. Once we do that, we're gonna have beautiful flowers year after year. Alrighty guys, so that is about it for today. These have been 10 common things that can potentially destroy your orchids and how to go about them. I hope you found this video useful. Remember to check the description for additional orchid tutorials and videos, and also for the rePotme products that I told you about. So thank you for watching. Thank you rePotme for sponsoring yet another video. If you're interested in other plants, even aquatic plants, check out my second channel where I post aquascaping content and other plants. But most importantly, for orchids, do subscribe to this channel because I post regularly. So that's it. I'll see you all next time. Bye!